On today's show, it is Labor Day, and it's now September, of course, and that means actually later on this month, Media Day arrives, training camp begins, all that fun stuff is very, very close to coming to fruition for the Atlanta Hawks. And on today's podcast, we'll dive into your mailbag questions and much more, and all of that is coming up.
You are Locked On Hawks, your daily Atlanta Hawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello, friends. Welcome to episode 1792 of the Locked On Hawks podcast. I am your host, Brad Rowland, coming to you on a Monday evening. And in fact, it's Labor Day evening as I'm recording this podcast. And today's show is brought to you by the folks at the Game Time app. Download the Game Time app right now, create an account, and use promo code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Download Game Time today. What time is it? It's game time. I also want to encourage you at the top of the podcast, as I always do here on the show, to make us your first listen here at Locked On Hawks each and every day. Please check us out and subscribe to the podcast anywhere you find podcasts. That includes places like Spotify and Apple, as well as Overcast on the audio side. And we're also on YouTube. Please like this video as you are watching it and subscribe and tell your friends about the podcast. It's been very busy on the show. This is our first episode of September. Also, the first time in a while that I've been by myself for the entire episode. But we had 15 episodes in the month of August. Even in the quote-unquote dead zone of the NBA, we were very busy. Visits from Tyler Jones and Glenn Willis and David Lee, Ben Ladner, etc., plus some schedule stuff as the schedule came out a few weeks ago, and much, much more beyond that. We had 4 shows this last week before Labor Day, and now we're into September, where later this month, technically, 4 weeks as I'm recording this podcast from today, is Media Day, and then training camp begins the next day on October 1st. So we're almost there. We're getting closer and closer, and plenty more to preview the season all the way through. And then if you're a new listener, what we do here is ramp it up to like 4 or 5 shows per week once the season's up and running. So stay tuned. We'll have plenty on the horizon. And we're opening up with a mailbag today, post Labor Day, and then we'll have more and more until Media Day training camp. We'll have some preview stuff coming, of course. We'll have over-unders across the league, hopefully with my friend Robbie Cowan, who's always on this podcast to do that. We have more with Glenn Willis coming up as well on the player capsule stuff with Trae Young, Jalen Johnson, Onyeka Okongwu, etc. But all that said, today's podcast is going to be mostly driven by your mailbag questions. So we'll dive in right now to the first one. And most of them are touching on Hawks stuff for the season, etc. And always, we're taking your questions, by the way, in various ways. You can send them to me on Twitter/X at LockedOnHawks or at BT Rowland as my personal account. Also, you can email the show at lockedonhawks@gmail.com. If you also are following my work on Patreon, you can send questions there at patreon.com/BT Rowland. All right, question from Vincent, who says, sorry if I missed you talk about this already, but what do you think of Jake Fisher saying Jalen Johnson wants the max? So this comment's a couple weeks old at this point in time because I've been doing shows with guests and other topics in the last couple of weeks, but good idea to answer this now. Kind of touched on this. We're sort of in the mid-cycle of the extension cycle right now. Jake Fisher is a friend of mine, just full transparency there. He also works for Yahoo, and he's one of the hosts of the No Cap Room podcast. He said on that show that and this is a loose quote for me, it's not a direct quote at all, that Jalen and his reps are hoping for the max in extension talks this summer/fall. He also noted very plainly that he believes that that's just what good agents are trying to do, not that they're expecting to get the max necessarily. I would say, broadly speaking, I have heard that the Jalen side of things is asking for a lot, and that is very normal this time of year. That should not surprise anyone for an up-and-coming, high-ceiling player who's already good, like Jalen is. We're not quite to crunch time yet when it comes to extension talks. I always say this, but the vast majority of rookie extensions, which means like before your 4th year, get done immediately in July, or they get done all the way at the end of the process. The Hawks have had some late ones in recent years. DeAndre Hunter got done late. Okongwu got done late. Kevin Huerter, I think there are 3 biggest ones recently, all got done in October. Trae Young's was early because that was a no-brainer max. But all that said, this is going to go on probably for a while, all the way up to the October 21st deadline, which is the day before the season when the actual deadline is coming up. So far in this draft class, this 2021 draft class that's up for extensions this year that Jalen is a part of, only 4 guys in the first round have signed extensions, and they are all massive $200 million extensions. Kay Cunningham, Scotty Barnes, Evan Mobley, and Franz Wagner are the 4 guys who have signed. No one has signed for less than that at this point in time. Now, there are guys who are going to be in line for a lot of money. Not only Jalen, but Alperen Sengun, Jalen Green, Jalen Suggs, Jonathan Kuminga, and Trey Murphy are all probably going to be getting high level contracts if they agree to extensions. But I'll just say this. I do not believe that Jalen is going to get the max in an extension a year ahead. Now, if he does not sign an extension this year and he blows up and has a great season, could he get the max next summer? Absolutely. But as far as him getting the max in an extension, I would be surprised if that happened. And I would imagine that Clutch, who represents Jalen, does not really believe that they're probably likely to get that either. But that's where you start if you were a player on Jalen's level. You ask for the moon, and then maybe you come back down a little bit. I think that if a deal gets done, again, if a deal gets done, it's going to be for at least $30 million annual value. It may not start above 30, but the average annual value will be above $30 million. I'm pretty confident in that if it happens. Otherwise, I don't think Jalen's side is going to take this extension, and they'll roll it over willingly to next year. There's obviously some risk in that. There is a certain level of, this is a lot of money. And with the current way the NBA economics are working, it's a little bit interesting because, like, for instance, like DeJounte Murray, it's a veteran extension, it's a different situation. But at a certain point, $100 million is $100 million guaranteed. So maybe guys' asking prices will be a little bit lower, and they'll just kind of take the security. That's total life-changing money, of course. But I think objectively speaking, from what I've heard, they're going to be asking and not going to be willing to sell for too much less than what they're asking for. I do think that I'll talk about this a little bit more when we get closer to the deadline. It's still 7 weeks away, basically. But to answer this question directly that I got, Jake was not saying that Jalen's going to get the max. Just that Clutch is starting to ask there on the negotiation front. If you're the Hawks, and I always say this, so forgive me for repeating myself, but you have to get some sort of concession, in my mind, if you are Atlanta and negotiating this contract, because he's not a no-brainer max player right now. Very few guys, I think, should not be really hardly negotiated with. They have to be basically already stars to not negotiate pretty hard, because my general personal view, this is not the view of everyone, my personal view is if you're on the team side, unless you are getting a discount, you don't do an extension a year ahead of time, because all the risk transfers over to you the minute you do an extension ahead of time. So there needs to be sort of a back and forth there where you're getting a discount. So the most recent example for the Hawks is literally 12 months ago. Last summer, we saw Landry Fields and company hold the line on Saddiq Bey. Saddiq asked for a lot of money. The Hawks offered him a decent extension. I've heard numbers, but I won't throw them out there now. But it was less than what Saddiq wanted. The Hawks drew the line in the sand, as they should have. They didn't go up above that. They didn't find an extension. With Onyeka, they got a discount. I think the whole league kind of acknowledged that was a discount for Onyeka. And they signed that deal because it was favorable for the team. That's the way this should work. You should not be signing deals a year ahead of time, because, again, a year ahead of time, there's no risk of Jalen leaving next summer. He'll be restricted. If the Hawks want to keep him, they can pay him the max and keep him. But, it's a mixed bag. I think for the most part, in the more modern, Trae Young era, however you want to say that, last 5-6 years, the Hawks have only really done one extension that was bad a year ahead of time, and that was DeAndre Hunter's extension, which there's been rumblings about that, like ownership involvement, all those things. But that was not a good deal, and everyone knew it right away, and that looks like a bad deal now. But the other one that they've done a year ahead of time are Onyeka and Kevin Huerter, both of whom Huerter's deal got traded as positive value, so that was a good extension. Onyeka's is a good deal, and then Trae was a no-brainer. There have been guys they've re-signed. John Collins was not an extension. They signed Collins as a free agent, for instance. So anyway, long story short, Jalen's asking for a lot of money. The Hawks, I'm sure, will give him a lot of money if he wants it, but there is probably going to be a dividing line, and that's always the art here, is whether they can find that middle ground in an extension. TBD on that, but I think the Hawks have done pretty well on this in recent years, including this front office last summer, did the right thing on both accounts, not overpaying Bey, and then only doing the deal with Okongwu because it was a pretty good value. So we'll see how that goes. But I heard that chatter from Jake. He wasn't reporting anything crazy. That's a very normal ask. I'm sure it's the same ask that guys like Jalen Green and Alperen Sengun are asking for, probably the max right now. Doesn't mean they're going to get it, but that's where your agent has to start, and then you kind of find the middle ground if you can find it later on. Question from Lee, who says, what is up with ESPN's summer forecast and all of the Hawks hate? So it's interesting. ESPN does the summer forecast. It's this panel. They don't describe how many people are on the panel. They don't say who's on the panel. We don't know who's on it or how big it is. But it's kind of separate from like preview content that Kevin Pelton might do, which I always look forward to Pelton's analysis because it's actually very grounded in numbers. I don't always love it, but I trust Pelton to be well researched and do a good job. Same with Zach Lowe. Those guys are a little bit separate, but there's panel they do. It's this, I don't know who it is, but anyway, summer forecast. It's kind of to bridge the content between the middle of the summer and the top 100s, all that stuff. That came out in the last couple of weeks, right? And the Hawks hate thing is funny, but it's also kind of true in this instance. So one thing here is that ESPN did this vote on which team is going to, quote, take a tumble this season. And the Hawks finished third in the voting, which I don't quite understand. Behind the Lakers and Clippers, and tied with Chicago. I've done the bit already, but it seems like people are just literally saying that they traded DeJounte, so they have to get worse. but that ignores a lot of things. It ignores that they obviously underperformed last year. It ignores that Trae and DeJounte just did not work together. It ignores that Trae and Jalen missed 54 games combined, which is a third of the season for both players. It ignores that defensive personnel is better for the Hawks this year. It ignores all of that stuff. Because it'd be different if the Hawks had won 45 games last year. Sure, project some regression if you want to. The Hawks underperformed. They were a mid-30s win team last year. So I'm not sure where the tumble is coming from. Is it possible they win fewer games than last year? Yes, it is possible. Am I picking that? No. Is it possible? Yes. But I don't really see them taking a step back in the way that like the Clippers probably will without Paul George, or the Bulls being the Bulls and trying to rebuild now, for instance. Like I don't really get that projection. So that's one thing. The other thing on their summer forecast that involves the Hawks, and I think I talked about this with Ben Ladner last week or 2 weeks ago on the show, talking about the Eastern Conference, but the Hawks are projected for 31 wins by this panel. That's weirdly low, I would say. And maybe that's why they have them on the tumble list, because that's obviously would be a tumble. I find this projection silly. The betting market, which I'm actually higher than, is in the 36-ish win range right now. That's modest in itself, but going 5 games below that does not really make a lot of sense to me right now. And the part that I don't really understand at all is that there is a 14-game gap between the 8 seed and the 9 seed. ESPN's panel has the Hawks as the 9 seed, which isn't a play-in, which isn't the worst thing in the world. Like if the Hawks finish 9th, I won't be surprised. It's the win total I don't understand. But I could pretty much guarantee you this. Like I wouldn't bet my life savings, but I would be very confident, let's say, that if the Hawks win 31 games, they won't be the 9 seed. I can't imagine the 9 seed in the East winning 31 games. Somebody's going to win in the mid-30s. Someone's going to win in the high 30s that will be in that slot. But anyway, it's too low. Do I care that much? No, it's early. We'll get something in a second when it comes to NBA 2K ratings. That came up a lot in my mentions that we'll talk about in a whole segment in a moment. This stuff doesn't really matter, quote unquote, but it is good offseason fodder. And this ESPN panel is obviously way too low. I agree with you, Lee. It's too low. It's pretty crazy. What's up with it? I don't really know, but maybe it's really as simple as what I've been saying for a while, that some people in the basketball space are just seeing, oh, they traded Murray for a future-facing package. That means they're going to be worse. I don't agree with that, but we'll leave it there for now. All right, we'll have more on this in a second before we get to some mailbag questions on 2K ratings and all that kind of stuff in the future. But first, a word from our sponsors on today's show. Today's show is brought to you by Game Time, and Game Time is the best place to find tickets, and there's nothing like checking out a live event, whether you're into sports, music, theater, or comedy. They also have a new feature at Game Time called Game Time Picks that makes getting tickets even easier for you. They filter out all the stuff that you don't need and only show you the incredible deals they do have and the great seats that they have available, and so you have to waste any time searching through thousands of different tickets that you don't actually want. For example, there are awesome deals this week for Braves-Rockies games in Atlanta, including a pair of tickets that are available right now for $12 each, including fees for the game on Thursday. That's an awesome deal, of course, and there's more of that happening at Game Time all of the time. Plus, my personal favorite feature of Game Time is that you can actually view seats through all-in pricing, like I did with those tickets, so you actually have no surprise fees at the end of the checkout process. Also get a view from your seats in the app before you buy them, so you know what to expect when you get to the actual venue when you arrive, and you're also getting the lowest possible price guaranteed with the folks at Game Time. Take all the guesswork out of buying tickets with the Game Time app. Download the Game Time app right now, create an account, and use promo code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create that account at Game Time and redeem that promo code. It is LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Download the Game Time app today. What time is it? It's game time. All right, so as I teased before the break, I got a lot of questions about this topic, so I'm not even going to pick one. I'm going to talk about the entire thing on the whole, and it's about the NBA 2K ratings. Now, first and foremost, I'll say this probably one more time later on in this answer. I don't really care about this, and my friend Tower Jones has been on the show many times. I'm sure he's going to hear this and fast forward because it's a bit that we have together. I am more interested in the top 100 lists that come out later on this month. Like ESPN always does one. The Athletic usually, some different outlets do top 100 lists. SI does one usually. Those are interesting, more interesting than I think that this is. But NBA 2K, while it's not my thing, is a big audience. It's big on the internet, all that stuff, and it creates questions and people asking me stuff and perception issues, I would say. So going from top to bottom on the Hawks here, Trae Young is number 1 on the list as far as highest rating rated player on the Hawks. That makes sense. He's their best player by a wide margin right now. He currently is in a tie with NBA 2K ratings with 5 other guys in the NBA between number 21 and number 26 overall. NBA, again, put out 2K, I should say, put out a top 100 list, which is where I'm getting a lot of this stuff from. their own list. They just published it, and here's the top 100. It's in order, etc. Trae is in that low to mid 20s range. While I think Trae is underrated in a vacuum by the entire league right now, which we'll come back to later on this podcast as a little wink, wink. This is fine. I could go player by player, but I won't do that now. And I have some qualms, but I think Trae being in the 21 to 24, something like that range is totally fine, and I'm not bothered by that at all. So my issues are lower down. Again, top 100 list is out there. Trae is the only Hawk on the list. One more time. They released a top 100 list of players in the NBA. There are 30 teams in the league. There's one Hawk on the list, and it's Trae Young. I find that pretty silly. Of course, again, this is where I give the disclaimer one more time that ratings don't really matter that much. It's not, but it's a talking point. Back to the ratings. It is, to me, indefensible to not have Jalen Johnson and Bogdanovic on the list, much less leaving both of them off the list. Both those guys would be in my top 70 comfortably, I would say, based on Jalen's trajectory and where Bogey was a year ago. Technically, Jalen has the same overall rating of 80 as a few guys that are at the bottom of the top 100 list. So you could say that maybe you could say he's tied with the bottom guys on the list, but he's not on there. And Bogey's a 79, which is a point below. I'm not going to list every player that I would have these guys ahead of, but here's a few guys that NBA 2K currently has rated higher than Bogey and or Jalen. No order in particular here. Jonas Valanciunas. Yeah, that's crazy. Tyler Hero, who I know I'm lower on, but regardless. Kyle Kuzma, DeAndre Ayton. Josh Hart is a guy I love, but come on. Cam Thomas is somehow ahead of Jalen Johnson and Bogdanovic. Austin Reeves, the current 2024 version of Chris Paul. Chris Paul is a first ballot Hall of Famer. Chris Paul right now is obviously not better than Jalen Johnson or Bogdanovic. Jalen Duren, who's not done anything in the NBA. D'Angelo Russell. And my personal favorite, Nikola Vucevic, who I would say was an actively harmful bad player last year, is still ahead of Jalen and Bogey on this list. Again, that was not even comprehensive. Just a bunch of names, including some that they're so wrong it's not even worth talking about. So back to the Hawks guys. Jalen got the most outrage on my mentions for not being on the list. I get why. He's obviously on the ascent. It's crazy to me to have a top 100 right now without him on it. Because, look, I understand that some of Jalen's appeal, and I've been the first to say this, some of Jalen's appeal is future-facing. He's probably not as good, well, at least last season. When we last saw him, he probably is not as good last year as some Hawks fans think that he already is. That's very normal for young players. There's always this trend, and I always fight it against it in the entire league of, acting like a player's already where they're going to be in a couple years. But Jalen, last year, averaged 16 points, 9 rebounds, and was efficient and pretty good defensively. That in itself, and I'm not the biggest box score stats guy, but that alone is a top 100 player in any way, shape, or form, especially a guy playing a combo forward role. That's a very valuable archetype. Anyway, I'll stop for now, but that's crazy. Bogey might even be a worse omission, though, as far as currently, because I would argue that Bogey might have been better than Jalen last year because Bogey played more minutes. Bogey, as I've talked about with Glenn, Willis, a good plug for that. It was awesome. We talked about it was a 2-part episode that we did last week. Bogey was really, really, really good last year. And whereas you could argue Jalen's future is ahead of him, Bogey's in his prime right now and was as an established player with a long record of success. So anyway, most of the questions I got were about Jalen and Bogey. It's insane. I'm with you all the way. I'll stop for now on that. From there, NBA 2K rated Capella and Kongwu as 80s, the same rating that Jalen got. Now, Jalen should be higher than them, to be fair, but those are okay ratings for Clint and Onyeka, I would say. Those guys are fringe top 100 players right now. I think Clint is probably right there at the end of it for me. I know I'm higher on Clint, but Clint is obviously trailing down, not trailing up, so that's fair. That's fine with me. Onyeka's going up. I think Capella's been better than Okongwu, but maybe they will intersect this year as Okongwu goes up and Clint goes down. Fine ratings, no issues at all with those two. Bogey has the same rating as DeAndre Hunter. That is insane. Now, I will defend DeAndre Hunter sometimes. I think he gets a little bit too much hate in some circles, but he is clearly not as good as Bogey, and this is too high for him for what he has been in the league. I'll leave that there. It's actually Larry Nance after that as the 7th best rating on the team at 77. That actually isn't too crazy. I think Larry Nance, because of Hawks fans don't know him very well, is underrated by fans right now. Like, he's a good player. He just happens to be on a team where he's the third best center. But he's a good player. That's actually fine with me. Daniels is too low. I think the consensus is too low on him overall right now. But then that's just whatever. Here's what gets actually crazy dumb one more time. David Roddy, who actually is fine, but anyway, David Roddy and Cody Zeller are ahead of, they have higher ratings than Vit Krejci and Garrison Matthews, which is not based in reality right now for how the league went last year. Again, I don't actually kind of buy David Roddy as a potential contributor to this team. But if you ask me who I'd rather have between David Roddy and Vit Krejci right now, it would be Vit pretty comfortably. And Roddy's rated 2 points higher. So that's kind of silly. A little bit of nice respect for Don Barlow. Good to see that. A guy I like a lot. Anyway, I'll leave it there for now. There's more on this I could do, but it's a silly exercise. But my overarching point is Trae's rating is fine, which is, I guess, encouraging. But I can't tell you how silly it is to have a rating like this, a top 100 list like this without without Bogey and Jalen on it. If ESPN has a similar thing, I'll do the same rant again in a different way, or The Ringer or SI or whoever does top 100 lists. I would imagine you will see Jalen and or Bogey on most of those lists. If you don't, that would be a mistake. But yeah, I actually would expect a trendy, like, online-facing video game to be higher on Jalen Johnson. He's an exciting, trendy player, but that didn't happen, and we'll leave it there for now. Okay, more to come in a moment when it comes to questions about Trae Young's trade value. Also, a little bit on my guy Bob Rathman at the end of the show, legend in himself, and Dylan Windler is no longer going to be at least an option for Atlanta. Before we get to all of that stuff, though, a word from our sponsors on today's show. Today's show is brought to you by BetterHelp. And what is something that you would love to learn in your life? As an adult, do you happen to make time for learning new things as often as you would like to, or was that lost at some point in your childhood somewhere? It's great to have curiosity on the whole, and you can seek that out and find it with the folks at BetterHelp. Therapy can be helpful for everyone. It can also help you to focus on what you want instead of what others happen to have in your life. That starts to help you living your best life as well. You can learn positive coping skills and how to set better boundaries at BetterHelp. I know I have my own stresses that I deal with on a regular basis. We also benefit across the board from getting things off of our chest with the folks at BetterHelp. If you're thinking about starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try right now. It's entirely online, and BetterHelp is also designed to be convenient and flexible to your schedule. It's perfectly suited to that schedule, which is huge if you're not having like time crunches like I do on a regular basis. If you're trying to fit stuff in your schedule, they are very helpful with that at BetterHelp. All you have to do is fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist, and then you can also see a therapist at any time for no additional charge. Rediscover your curiosity with the folks at BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/LockedOnNBA to get 10% off your first month with BetterHelp. One more time, the place to go is BetterHelp. That's better, H-E-L-P, BetterHelp.com/LockedOnNBA. Okay, question from Todd, who says, what's the real story with Trae Young's trade value? The Hoop Collective acted like he had none at all, and that the only reason he wasn't traded was because no one wants him. Is that true? All right. So almost two questions here. One's about his actual trade value. One's about this podcast that was released by ESPN Scoop Collective. I'll answer the podcast one first, kind of a bridge to the actual big picture answer. For one thing, I like the Hoop Collective, generally speaking. I'm a listener to that show. I like Wendy. I like McMahon. I don't know those guys very well. I've met them both. Nice guys. I don't know them. I am friends with Tim Bontemps. I will admit that. We are friendly offline from basketball circles. But anyway, the quote that made the rounds on Hawks Twitter in the last couple of days was this from McMahon of ESPN again, who says, quote, the simple fact of the matter is that if there was a real market for Trae Young, he would be somewhere else right now, end quote. What I would say is that overstates things pretty significantly. And that feeds into the actual answer a little bit about what his trade value is actually like. So I talked about this a little bit earlier this summer, but the reality is I do not think Trae Young's trade value in the league matches how good he is, which means he's undervalued in my opinion. But that does not change the fact that his trade value is not that high for what he actually should be. And that reality does, I think, contribute a little bit to at least some degree to him still being on the Hawks right now, because the Hawks were not going to sell low on Trae Young. They were not going to trade him for parts, especially when they owe their own picks to San Antonio. We've covered that endless times on this podcast in past months. We'll never know, but two things can be true here. I think McMahon's very much overstating the case. I would not frame it that way. That's incorrect, in my opinion, to say that the only reason he's still in Atlanta basically is that he there was no market for him. I would say this. Hawks fans are going too far the other way that I've seen today. I saw people saying that, that's crazy. He was never talked about. I will tell you this. If the Hawks had gotten a Godfather offer, a superstar level offer for Trae Young, they would have listened. He was not untouchable this summer. That's not a value judgment by me. I'm not saying that's what I would have done. He was not untouchable. He used to be untouchable. 2-3 years ago, if you called the Hawks on Trae Young, they would have laughed and hung up the phone. That is not where they were this last summer. So it's also incorrect to say, oh, the Hawks would never, ever, ever have traded Trae Young. That isn't the case. What I will say is that they're not like actively marketing him in trade. Part of that is, again, his value is a little bit lower right now around the league. And I think that it's also true to say that offer wasn't out there. So I don't agree with McMahon's assertion at all that he'd be gone if he had a market. And he compared it to Murray's situation, talking about how the Hawks didn't get a blockbuster haul for Murray. As a sidebar, the deal for DeJounte was an appropriate return. You don't have to like it, but they got 2 first-round picks, a young lottery pick, and an established rotation player in Larry Nance for DeJounte Murray. That's a totally fine return. So people keep acting like that, like the Hawks didn't get a lot for him. It wasn't a crazy, I said at the time, it wasn't an A++++ return, but that was a totally appropriate good return for DeJounte Murray. Anyway, Young is better than Murray. And yes, Young has flaws. I've argued recently, I did on Twitter the other day, I went through a little bit of a thread. You can find it if you want to. And people misconstrue that with me saying that like Trae is a top 10 player. No, I don't think that Trae is a top 10 player in the league. I don't. I do think that he's underrated, and people have forgotten how good he is. He has flaws. He could be tough to build around. I've argued that for years. But it's not as if you're going to give that guy away. He's really good. You don't give that guy away. Trae, you don't sell low on him. It'll be an interesting year for Trae and the Hawks and their partnership, because I think next summer is a pretty logical extension point for Trae Young. If both sides are happy, he might get locked up to a long-term deal. If not, you'll start to hear the Donovan Mitchell situation, because this last summer it was like, all right, if Donovan doesn't sign an extension in Cleveland, he probably gets traded. Next summer is going to be the Trae Young version of that, where if it doesn't go well, he might ask for a trade. The Hawks might proactively trade him. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but if it goes well, you see an extension. So a year from now is the big inflection point. The Hawks were never close to trading Trae Young, but I think Tim is wrong on this. I'm sure he has sources. I'm sure someone's told him that, but I think he's wrong from what I've heard. It is what it is. It's overstated at the very least. And I'm not sure where the sides are right now. But overall, I don't agree with Tim's assertion. There is some nuance to where Trae's actual trade value might be right now. If the Hawks decided on September 2nd to trade Trae Young, they would get a good haul for him. It would not be a haul that I would accept, if that makes sense. And that's where I'll leave it for now. All right, before we get out of here, there was a little bit of minor Hawks adjacent news. That's Dylan Windler is actually going to Australia. Now, no surprise here. The Hawks don't have a roster spot. The Hawks have a full roster. It's still quiet on the Nikola Jurisic front for those people asking about him. We'll see when Kent comes around. He's obviously hurt right now. The Hawks have a full roster. The Hawks like Dylan Windler a lot. They brought him to Summer League. They signed him last year with a two-way. They like Dylan Windler. They have nowhere to put him. So it was not a surprise to me or anybody else that he signed a deal in the NBL in Australia. I think he's a fringe NBA player, but he'll be good in Australia. I just want to throw that out there. He's no longer an option for the Hawks moving forward. And one last final shout out at the end of the podcast to my guy, Bob Rathman. Bob is, of course, the TV voice of the Hawks, has been for the last 28 seasons. He'll be 29th season this year for Bob at Bally Sports Southeast. He was announced recently as a member of the next class of the Georgia Sports Hall of Fame. Bob is a listener to the show, but also more importantly to me, a friend of mine. He did the Dream for a decade, tons of college stuff, Brave stuff, doing TBT every summer, et cetera, et cetera. I use this term a lot in a joking fashion. I'm not joking about this one. Bob is a legend. I mean that. He's going to hear this and he won't like that I said it. It's fine. Bob is a legend. He's also looked out for me quite a bit in the decade plus that I've been covering the Hawks. So I'm lucky to call him a friend. Shouts to Bob at the end of the podcast. I'm sure everybody will agree. He's the best of the best. And congrats to you, my guy, for a cool honor there. All right. That's all I have on today's podcast. Please go ahead and subscribe to this show anywhere you find podcasts. Check us out on Apple. Check us out on Spotify. Check us out on YouTube. Like this show as you're watching it right now. Go ahead and do it. Smash the like button. And then please subscribe to the show on that platform. Leave 5-star ratings and reviews across the board as well. And do me a favor. Now that we're in September, it's I know football is definitely here in full force now. Basketball is getting closer. I'm sure you have somebody in your life that might like the Hawks as much as you do, or maybe a little bit less than you, but enough to listen to a podcast. Share this with them. post it on Twitter, post it on Instagram, post it on Facebook. Help me out. I would very much appreciate it to try to grow the show a little bit going into next season. We'll have much more content coming up even later this week and then going into next week and the week after that. No days off for this podcast. So please go ahead and subscribe. Follow the show on Twitter /X at Locked On Hawks. Follow me there at BT Rowland. Follow my non-podcast work at patreon.com/BT Rowland. All right, everybody, I'm signing off now. Enjoy the rest of your Labor Day. If you're listening to this podcast late night on Monday, start to the week on Tuesday, and we'll see you all next time.